For more than 47 years, I always made it a practice never to lie to my wife. I think too many bad things can come about if lying to the one you're closest to comes easily. But in this case, I didn't want anyone knowing about where I was going or what I was going to be doing. They would have worried. Everyone worries now. Just because there is snow on the rooftop and because it takes me a while to pee doesn't mean that I'm not capable of looking out for myself. I don't need guardians yet. If anyone knew what I was going to be doing, they would be making appointments with the doctors to get my noggin checked. They would think that I really had started going around the big curve, but I'm not. I know what I know, and I've known it for a long time. I've lived with a secret for longer than most of the folks I know have been alive. Jody, you're going to inherit all of this one day soon, and you need to know what I know. You probably won't believe it, but you need to know it. It took me longer to get here than I thought it would. I guess that my memories of this place included the young fresh legs that had carried me here back then. Pretty well tuckered out by the time I got here, but I think it was worth the effort. I could have done what I'm going to do out in the shed where I build birdhouses and things, but it seems important for me to do it here. I think I have a clear memory of all that I saw, but being in the same place, well, I thought it might be of some benefit. I think I'm starting to think like my grandfather used to think. I never imagined I would ever be as old as he was, but guess what? Here I am. I don't know how long the batteries in this little tape recorder are supposed to last, but I suppose I should get on with the business at hand before they play out from my rambling. I'm going to go down and drop it into a safety deposit box along with a couple of other things I already have in there. The key for the box will be in an envelope amongst my effects, and when I pass on, the note in there will tell everyone that this recorder belongs to my grandson and him alone. This is not the way I wanted to do this, but I believe it to be the best way. Jody, I wanted to leave you with something besides the property. I wanted to leave you a warning. Watch your back up here, but if you can find a way to hold on to the property without ever coming here, then that is what I would advise you to do. This should not have fallen to you to worry about, at least not for a while. I should have been saying all of this to your father, God rest his soul. It wasn't his wish for his heart to just give out and give up. He had a lot of living he wanted to do yet. He wanted to see the man that you're becoming. He couldn't have been any prouder than you than I am, but he would have been just as proud. The reason I'm not telling you any of this to your face is because of two reasons. One, you wouldn't have believed me, and I wouldn't have blamed you. But I don't have time to try and convince you or your mother or your grandma that I haven't had some sort of spell and suddenly gone peculiar, because I haven't. I have no intentions of proving myself to anyone in the family or whatever doctor they see fit to let have a go at me. And the second reason why you are hearing this from a machine instead of me is because if you had trusted in my words, I knew that there would be no way of stopping you from coming. I was 15 once too. It may have been before they had invented fire or the wheel, but I was your age once. I thought I was bulletproof and could eat gravel just like you think you can. I hope that I haven't passed on before you're mature enough to use some common sense about all of this. All of this is a warning to stay away. It's not an invitation to go on an adventure. The last thing that you need to do is come to where I am now. The whole earth is an ancient place. The good book gives us an idea of how old the earth is, and those men with pocket protectors and slide rules, they have their own ideas too, but they both say this place where we all live has been around for quite a time. But some places on this earth are more ancient than others. There are things that lasted just like those old places, things that man wasn't ever supposed to know about. That might be wrong. maybe it was okay that we knew about them, but we never were supposed to mingle with them. Those things in those ancient places ought to be left alone. Let them mind their business and we mind ours. I think that is the way it should work. I think that way because I know things that others don't, and I wish I didn't. I wish I wasn't telling you all about it, but sometimes we don't get to choose what is ours to deal with. I guess that's my way of stating at the beginning, but let's skip ahead a few thousand years to where I can talk about what I actually know. The land, as you know, was staked and claimed by my great-grandfather long before I had ever come along. It was rough and rolling, so most folks just sort of gave it the stink eye when they saw it. But Great-Grandpa knew two things: timber and mules. He knew with the right animals he could snake the finest wood off these ridges, and he was right. He made a decent living and raised a fine family off what this land gave him to work with. My daddy eventually did too. He learned everything that Grandpa had to teach him, and his brothers did well here too. I think my daddy was getting worried about all of this until I came along. I had 4 older sisters, and Daddy wasn't keen on girls having to work out in the woods like men. It wasn't that my sisters couldn't have done it, it was just that Daddy wanted better for them than sweaty backs and calloused hands. But I happened up and Daddy began to teach me everything that he had been taught just as soon as I was old enough to listen. The trees kept growing while Daddy kept getting older. The day finally came when he just couldn't do the work any longer, and I believe that broke his heart. He had a special connection with all of this, maybe even a stronger bond than his father or his grandfather had held. These ridges had supported and provided for generations for us, so Daddy always saw himself more as a caretaker than a user, and I respected that about him. That's why I regret for more reasons than one ever breaking one of his rules. Now, at the time I didn't think too much about it, but now I see why this one particular thing was so important to him. I wish to God that I had listened. Back in those days, and I'm talking about the time when I was old enough to do more than my share of work and Daddy wasn't able to do any, I had a friend that signed up to help me out here. This was back in the Dark Ages when people weren't especially fond of Indians. They called them Injuns back then, and that was one of the nicer things they were called back then. I think that we're all supposed to say Native Americans now. This friend of mine had a name that I never could pronounce, so I just called him Herbie. He thought it was clever. I called him that because his mother was all the time sending him out looking for this or that herb. He knew that I wasn't being disrespectful, and I wouldn't have been for anything in the world. He was a dear good friend to me, and I thought of him as I would have a brother, I guess. I don't know that for sure, seeing as I never had a brother. But I thought an awful lot of him and his whole family. Some look down on them, but you'll never hear me say an ugly word about Herbie or his family. They were good people. The fact that their skin was browner than mine didn't make one bit of difference to me. The color of a man's skin ought to not ever matter. If he's a good man, then he's a good man. That should be the end of it. They had moved into this part of the country from Oklahoma when times out there got bad. They weren't thinking that times here were going to be good, just maybe a little better than back there, I suppose. They kept to themselves and worked real hard whenever anyone would give them a chance to work. A lot of folks wouldn't give them a chance, but me and Herbie ran across each other and made friends real quick like. Right from the start, we hit it off. He was interested in learning about mules, and I like hearing history stories of the Oklahoma Seminoles, so I guess we entertained each other in those hard times. He would bring things sent by his mother that were supposed to help my father with his pains and exhaustion, and my father was always grateful and drank those herb teas like he had been asked to, but they never really helped. Daddy had just worked himself to death over the years, and there wasn't any healing for that, but he would always take the offerings because he appreciated Herbie and his family so much. I can't tell you how nice that family was. They were the very best. So time went on and Daddy became more frail by the day, it seemed. Mother was doing all she could just tending to him, and my sisters had all found someone to make a future with. I guess it just dawned on me one day that no matter how hard I thought I was working, I needed to do more. I shared this with Herbie, and he understood my situation. I wouldn't have gotten anywhere with that concern if I had brought it up to my parents. They would have just talked about how good I was doing already, but I could talk serious with Herbie. We came up with what we thought wasn't just a good idea, but was also the only sensible option available. Each of us only had 1 year left in school before they officially said that we didn't have to come back anymore. But that was a year that I just didn't have time to give. Not to the dang county school system anyway. Herbie saw how great a burden I was under and decided that if I was going to quit school to work full time, then he was going to quit so that he could help me. You talk about stirring up a hornet's nest. We did when we dropped that particular bombshell. Daddy was barely able to sit up by himself, but he had enough spunk to give me quite a chewing. But since all he could do was lay there in his sick bed and yell, I figured I could pretty much do as I thought I should. Daddy never had gone as far through school as I already had, and I knew at the time that he was mad because he wanted better for me than he'd had. But I had told him that if I turned out even half the man that he was and Grandpa was, then I would be happy enough. It was when I mentioned that I was just trying to make sure that Mama was well provided for, just like he had always seen to, that he sort of simmered down and started looking at things the way that I was looking at them. Herbie's family didn't take the decision any better either from what he told me. I even tried to talk him out of joining me, but he wasn't having any of that. So with my folks having very little they could do about it, and Herbie's giving up after a while, we started working full time. From daylight until dark, those ridges were ringing with the sound of either me and Herbie chopping at those trees with our axes, or chewing into the wood with those big two-man saws. Every night I would drag myself into the house from the barn after seeing to the mules, and I'd eat a little of what Mama had left covered for me. I'd always thought myself to be hard and strong because I had done this type of work since I had been able to walk just about. But now me and Herbie were doing the work of 3 men, and it was hard. I knew what me and Daddy had been able to snake off those ridges when he had still been in his good health, and I was determined to exceed those numbers. Me and Herbie were young and in good health, so I drove the both of us to do more than could have been reasonably expected. I wanted Herbie to have something to show for all his hard work, and I wanted to make my daddy proud, to make up for how I had disappointed him when I had stopped going to school. I knew that my daddy was never going to be proud of me as I was of him, but that didn't stop me from trying. It was hard as a wet rock working like we were, but come daylight, we would already be back in the woods ready to go again. One day, while we were working, I looked up and saw Breezy weaving her hair through the trees toward us. Breezy was Herbie's younger sister. She wasn't more than a couple of years younger than us, and I know her name was some kind of breeze, fall breeze, warm breeze, stiff breeze, but I couldn't remember it any better than I could remember Herbie's real name, so I just called her Breezy. Her family liked that nickname, and soon everyone had started calling her Breezy. She was waving at us, not like she was saying hello or anything. She was waving to get our attention. I knew something had happened for Breezy to be out hunting for us. She never ventured out into the deep woods where Herbie and I had spent most of our time. I couldn't make up my mind which of Herbie's folks I wanted something to have happen the least, because both his parents had become like second sets of parents to me. When Breezy wouldn't look at her brother and only stared at me as we jogged over to meet her, I knew that I had been all wrong in my assumption. There was a look on her face that told me that whatever had happened had not happened to her family. Herbie must have read that expression on his sister's face like I had, because he grabbed me by the elbow and he wouldn't let go for love or money. I made Herbie stand beside me at the foot of Daddy's casket while we shook the hands of those who came to pay their respects. As far as I was concerned, Herbie was part of the family. My mother and my sisters were in complete agreement with my decision to have him there. And a couple of my brother-in-laws didn't much care for him, but I didn't care. I didn't care much for either of them either. Herbie wasn't keen on standing there because the way white people take care of their dead wasn't the same as his folks' way, but he thought the world of my father, so he stood there with the rest of us and he never said a word. After the funeral, the chapel where we had held Daddy's service threw a little lunch for all of the family. When people don't know what else to do to help, they cook and bring food. I was watching my sisters trying to get my mama to eat a little something with Herbie beside me when a man that I had never seen walked up and asked me if we could have a word in private. Well, I told him yes, and we started to walk outside so that we could find an isolated part of the yard to talk in. The man was holding the door open for me to walk through when I saw him cut his eyes all wrong at Herbie. Well, I told him that if he had anything to say to me, then he was going to say it in front of my friend, else we could all just go back inside and have another piece of chicken. The man didn't much like that, but he nodded his head and we all three went outdoors. He told me that his name was Fenneman, Arthur Fenneman. He now lived down in the eastern part of the state, but for his first 25 years or so, he had called this part of the country his home. He and my father had dulled a lot of saws together, broken a great many axe handles together too. Back then they had lived to cut, not cut wood to make a living. They had cut wood as long as there was daylight to swing an axe by, because they enjoyed the work so well. Arthur said that every so often, one or the other of them would go off scouting for the day, looking for and tagging trees that would produce wood that would bring the highest price. He told me that my father had always had a knack for spotting the trees that would cut the best and straightest boards. That was a useful talent to have, given the way we made our living, but he said that he was better at spotting the more out-of-the-ordinary things. There are two ways of making money in timber. You can cut the ordinary and mundane wood that everyone needs. That type of wood is always going to be sought after because it has so many uses. Or you can find the rarer things that is harder to work with and has more limited application, but it pays out bigger. On occasion, I could talk your father into gambling on something that I had found, he said, but not all the time. He told me that my father liked less but steadier cash coming in. He wasn't a gambler, especially not when the empty stomachs of his family were in the mix. One day when it was my time to be off on an explorer, I found what I thought was an opportunity of a lifetime. I ran back to tell your father. I didn't walk, I ran. I ran so fast and far that I had to stop twice just to throw up from the way I was pushing myself up and down those ridges. It wasn't like I was only a couple of ridges from where your father was working. We were miles apart, and I ran nearly every step of the way. He thought something was after me from the way I had run up on him and grabbed him. I was just hanging on while I caught my breath because I was sure that when I stopped running, I wouldn't be able to just stand there. My legs were shaking like a dog passing a peach pit. I don't know how long it was, but it was a long time before I could even say anything. The whole time your father was looking in every direction to see what had been chasing me and questioning me a mile a minute about what was wrong. Well, I couldn't talk. I just kept trying to wave him down. Looking back, I guess it would have been pretty funny to have watched. When I could talk, I told him of a place that I had found. and from what I could tell, it didn't look as if anyone had been there since Noah's flood. There wasn't a straight tree in that whole hidden grove of trees, but there were hundreds of trees there, and every one of them were knotted and bulging with burls. Arthur told me that my father hated fooling with burls, even though they were worth so much more money than the straighter timber. Every now and again we would cut one and go the extra trouble of getting it out of the woods, but it was seldom. Burls are hard to work with all the way around, but they won't crack or split if you handle them right because of all the insane grain lines. And they make the most looksome bowls and tables you can find. People pay better than good money for burl wood, and I just found the mother of all loads. I told your father where I found them, and boy did he catch me off guard with what he said. He told me that he knew exactly where I had been because he had seen the same trees for himself more than a dozen years earlier. He hadn't been back, and he wasn't gonna go back no matter how much money could be made there. He told me there was more out in those trees than gnarled up burls, and he wasn't having any of it. Arthur said he pleaded and argued with my father all the rest of the afternoon about just going and having a second look. Maybe it would look different to him now that as a grown man than it had when he had been a sprout, but he said Daddy wouldn't even consider going back. The argument grew so intense that Arthur swore and declared that he wasn't going to work himself stupid for pocket change for the rest of his life. He said that was the last time he had spoken to my father and that they never saw each other again. Arthur then told me that firstly he had come to pay his respects and to swear that all grievances were a thing of the past. He held no ill feelings toward my father any longer, but he also wanted to tell me of the place that he had found. He had known of the decline in my father's health and how I was taking over the business. Arthur no longer cut wood. He only bought it and sold it to someone else. He told Herbie and me that if we would go in and do the work, he would buy everything that we brought out from that place for double or triple the money that we were getting for straight trees. Then he handed me a card with a way to get in touch with him if I wanted to do business. Arthur Fenneman walked away and we went back inside where I watched my frail mama speaking to everyone. All I could think about was how I wanted to provide for her better than adequately and how that card felt like it weighed 10 pounds in my pocket. The next day, the day after we had laid Daddy to rest, Mama assured me that she was doing well enough for me to return to work. I didn't want to be away from her, but she pointed out that two of my sisters were still there, and also that because of our partnership, I also had to consider Herbie and his family. While Herbie might have grieved right along with us, just like he was family, he wasn't. He had his own family to help support, and to do that he needed income, and that was only going to come about if we went back to work. She also told me that even though she would have tended to Daddy another 10 years as she had been doing, she was relieved that he had passed and was no longer in pain. The 2 nights since he had died were the first 2 nights she had been allowed to sleep all the way through from dark to daylight in years. Reluctantly, I agreed that everything she said was correct, and I went back to doing what I knew how to do. It's what my daddy would have done. Herbie never asked me how I was faring as we rode the mules into the timber. I could see that he wanted to, but was afraid of saying anything that might make me think of something and start feeling bad. I told him that I was going to be okay and was excited to be getting back to work. And I also told him that I had been thinking quite a bit about all Arthur had said. He told me that Arthur's words had crossed his mind about 1,000 times as well. What Herbie didn't know was that I knew about the place Arthur had spoken of. I didn't know about what was there, just where it was. It was a place Daddy had made me promise to never go. And a promise is a promise, whether the person you made it to is alive or dead. But I couldn't turn down what Arthur was offering. I decided to wait until the end of the workday to tell Herbie of my intention to break the promise I had made to my daddy. We would be nearly finished working there and ready to do something new. I figured that was as good a time as any to start getting rich. All day long we worked, but our concentration was not on the task at hand as it normally was. I was wondering what that forbidden area actually looked like, and Herbie kept giving me long glances from the corner of his eyes when he didn't think I could see him. His family needed money just as badly as mine did, but I knew that he held promises made to his family members with a little more respect or importance than I did. Not that I thought breaking my word was a minor thing, it was just that he didn't think there was anything more important, and I thought the benefits outweighed the infraction. The woods were starting to soften as the day came to an end. It would be fully dark a good while before we came to the place where we went separate ways so Herbie could go home and I could go take care of the mules. Often I had made him the offer of living at our house so he wouldn't have to spend so much time traveling to and from work, but his mother wanted to prepare a supper for him each night. We didn't say much as we walked. We were tired like we always were, but we were both lost in heavy thought. Me wondering when to do as I had decided to do, and him wondering when I was going to drop the news on him. I had no idea if I was still going to have a partner after I made that announcement, and that worried me quite a bit. I didn't want to do this without him, but I was going to do what I needed to do no matter what. We came to where the road divided, and instead of him taking off on the one that bared left after a wave like he always did, Herbie just stopped and waited for me to speak. Sometimes Herbie was more clever or intuitive than I remembered to give him credit for. "We're going to where you told your father that we would not, aren't we?" he asked. "We are," I told him. "For the sake of both of our families, we can't afford not to go. My father worked himself into an early grave because he was afraid to make better money in an easier way. I have no intentions of following in his footsteps. Not in this, I don't. There is no law that says if we don't like what we see that we have to stay there and do the work. We can turn around and come right back to what we know works. But if we see what is supposed to be there, I have to see it for myself. I have to know if there's a better way to take care of my mother. If you are reluctant or have misgivings and fears, I'll not hold it against you if you choose not to go with me," I told Herbie. He studied me for a long moment, and even in the darkness I could feel his dark eyes studying me while he thought things over. I knew he was deciding on whether or not our partnership was to continue, and I could get no feel of which way he was leaning. Herbie was terribly comfortable with just standing still while he pondered things. "Do you know how far it is to this place that we're apparently going to?" he asked. I tell you, I breathed a sigh of relief when I heard those words. "Best as I can tell, it's a full day's walk from where we were working today," I said. "It'll be all we can do just to get there in time to roll up and get some sleep before we survey everything the following morning." He nodded his head and told me that he would pack some things tonight and meet me at my house an hour earlier than usual tomorrow morning. I was feeling pretty good about everything as I started home, until I remembered that I would have to tell my mother where I was going. I knew Mama would have liked getting up and sending me on my way with a good breakfast, but she was still sleeping when I woke up, so I let her have a lie-in. I did snitch 2 biscuits that I put a thick spread of bacon grease in between, and stuffed into my bib pocket of my overalls so that Herbie and me would have something to eat as we walked. I met Herbie on the road and I told him that the conversation I'd had the night before with my mother had gone surprisingly easier than I had supposed it would. She told me that my father had been his own man and had done things differently than my grandpa would have. Some of those things that he'd done had worked out well, and some he eventually understood why Grandpa had done things in the way he had. She told me that she and my father had always known that I would make certain decisions based only on what my own gut was telling me, and that I wouldn't always take advice about every move that I was ever going to make. She told me to be smart and be logical and be safe. And then she said she would look forward to hearing of my adventure into this forbidden land. I don't know for sure if that was supposed to be a joke or not. She didn't smile after she said it. She just patted me on the hand and she went to bed. Mother's always been real clever about hiding her worries. I didn't see any fretting on her face, but I have a feeling that she was dreading me going to where my father would not. Daddy never did tell me why he was so opposed to being near that place, and if he told Mama, she didn't let on in any way. I didn't sleep much that night, and it wasn't because I was excited. I was worried that I had made the wrong decision just because I thought I was a man enough to make it, and I wondered if I was doing it out of spite instead of for the reasons that I kept telling myself. I didn't miss the timing of the journey by much. The sun was just about gone when we topped the last ridge before going into the property that had always frightened my father and had held such fascination for me. We thought it best to spend the night where we were and see these new trees in good daylight after we had rested well. Well, the truth is, we didn't know what we would find down there, and we were both a little nervous about being in there in the dark. We were doing mannish things and making mannish decisions, but we were still just boys, and neither one of us had seen our 16th summer yet. But we weren't about to admit to each other that we were a little scared. We just kept making talk about all the reasons why we should keep our fannies out of there until there was light to see. We were both in full agreement on that point. It is a long way to travel if we find wood worth selling. Herbie said that to me just as I was about to finally doze off. He had been so quiet for so long, I thought that he had been asleep for the last hour. He was a real quiet type. I thought he had been asleep, and all the while he had been laying there thinking. I told him that I knew it was a long hike in and out of where we were, but the payoff was going to be great. We can hire 2 or 3 men with mule teams and do nothing but haul wood. And I thought my answer made me sound like I had been thinking too and had it all figured out before we had even started. And I really hadn't thought that far ahead. He was thinking about what we would find there, and I was fearing it. We didn't say anything else that night. We just laid there, and all the while I was wondering if he was as awake as I was. We awoke just as day was breaking. It came as a shock to me that we had both managed to fall asleep for a while. It wasn't as if we had rested the whole night through, mind you, but we did get some sleep. The birds were starting their morning songs, and even though I had grown up listening to and for them, they didn't sound the same that morning. Somehow they seemed more muted or even a bit leery, like they knew it was their nature to make a song but were afraid to do it for some reason. I thought it was just my nerves working on me from the trepidation I was feeling toward what we were going to do that day. But as I looked at Herbie, I saw that he was slowly looking around and taking in everything as well. He had noticed the difference also. He was a noticer. We didn't talk about it. We just got our plunder loaded onto the sled the mule was pulling and started down the ridge. We made it down to the bottom after sliding around the ridge, and we might as well have just stepped into a different state. Nothing looked like what I was used to seeing. Herbie's eyes were about as big around as my mama's cathead biscuits as he stared at the woods that lay in front of us. Like I said, Herbie was a noticer. We hadn't spoken in quite a while, so it sounded too loud when Herbie spoke up. Like how it sounds when you're talking in a church house. It always seems too loud unless you're whispering. The difference was that whispering or not, I always felt safe and welcome in a church house. I didn't feel either at the edge of those woods. I say edge because, like I mentioned, there was a night and a day difference between where we were standing and where we were going. Sometimes when you come off a hardwood ridge onto a low ground, you can feel the surroundings change as the softer woods start to mingle with the hardwood. It goes from oak and beech to pine and cedar, and little by little, but not this time. This time it switched from normal and vibrant to something out of a bad dream. It looked like if we went forward a couple of steps, we were going to find ourselves right in that bad dream. I say it like that because from what we could see, nothing looked real. I was trying to understand what I was looking at when Herbie spoke, and it made me jump a little. He said he wasn't sure if we ought to be going in there or not, but he was positive that we ought to leave the mule hobbled where it was, at least until we'd had a look around. I didn't say anything, but I nodded my head in agreement. Everything was gray-looking. The trees, the leaves, even the air was gray-looking. I know that you can't see air, only what hangs on it like smoke or fog, but it was clear as a bell where we were standing. But it was gray and hazy inside the underneath of those trees. It wasn't just for a little piece. Those deformed woods stretched out in all three directions as far as the eye could see. It wasn't as if all the trees were diseased or dead. I could tell easily enough that they were all alive and growing, but they looked muted and wrong, like the hands of someone who suffers terribly with severe arthritis. When I was younger, there was a man around who used to sell hot peanuts to make a living. He couldn't do much else, so he'd set up a little cart in town down from the courthouse every day except on Sundays. One day he would have boiled peanuts, and maybe the next he'd be selling them roasted. That doesn't matter. Just thought you ought to know a bit about him. His name was Mr. Darby, and he was as nice a man as I ever knew. Mr. Darby had been born crippled. His legs weren't worth a pair of nickels. My dad told me that the doctors had said that he would never be able to walk. They were right, but only to a certain extent. Mr. Darby started trying to walk about the age when all young ones try to start taking steps, I guess, but it didn't come easily for him the way it usually does for tots. And since his legs weren't straight and strong, he had to come up with a different way of making them work for him. He would roll those tiny, narrow feet over until he was just about walking on the sides of his feet instead of the soles. And then with the short little bowed legs, he would swing and lurch his way forward. It would make you hurt for him to watch him. And every step was a chore, but he was walking. Now I told you all that so that you might get the picture. For years and years, Mr. Darby used those legs in a way that they had never been intended to be used. And as a result, he made matters worse. He taught himself to walk all right, but he deformed his legs worse with each step. They were twisted and knotted and hard to look at. Those trees were the same way. Trees aren't supposed to look like these trees did. They all leaned and grew at strange angles. They were knotted up and covered with burls at every imaginable size. There wasn't a tree there that didn't have 6 to 8 burls growing up on the sides. Might be that the best way to conjure it up in your mind is to picture someone who always has 2 or 3 warts growing on them, and every one of those trees were like a warty person, except that the warts on those trees were worth a lot of money. I asked Herbie if he was ready to go in and have a closer look, and he asked me if it mattered if he was ready or not. I didn't answer him. I just started walking, and he followed along behind me. We walked in silence for a long time. That's not to say that we covered a lot of ground. We were awfully careful to notice the trees as well as pay attention to how we were walking. Something about that place made you be careful with your steps. But the farther we went without anything happening to us, the more normal our strides became. The trees didn't become more normal looking, though. If anything, they became more grotesque and disfigured the deeper in we went. But I was starting not to care. I was seeing dollars jutting out of the sides of those trees. I was becoming blinded by my greed, and I don't know what would have happened if it hadn't been for Herbie. We were just walking and looking, and I was thinking about the easiest way to get mules and sleds in and out when Herbie grabbed me by the arm so I would stop. I turned so that I could look at him, and there he was with his nose pointed up. He was taking great, deep sniffs and making faces after each one. I finally asked him what he was doing, and he asked me if I could smell the odor that was so strong. I told him that I didn't smell anything unusual and that it must be an Indian thing that allowed him to catch faint smells on what slight breeze there was. He told me that it wasn't an Indian thing, it was a being alive thing, and that he was about to gag because the smell was so terrible. What he couldn't understand was why I hadn't noticed it too. I told him to try not to throw up, but try to figure out the direction where the smell was the strongest, and we would go that way to see what it was. Well, I figured it was a deer or the like that had died and was beginning to put off that rotted smell. I would have felt better if Herbie had believed the same thing, but he didn't. He was staying hushed about whatever was weighing on his mind. We trekked on for the remainder of the morning, and Herbie was keeping that nose of his working, and I was following right along behind him like he was a setter bird dog, and I was waiting for him to strike on a covey of quail. Every so often he would stop and follow his nose around until he hit a scent in the strong way that he wanted to, and now and again I would think I caught a whiff of something, but never enough for me to be sure about. It was during one of those stops that I saw him turn and face a light breeze and then flinch like he had been slapped. I turned to face in the same direction that he was. That was when I caught it myself. There wasn't any doubt about it that time. That smell was so bad, I felt like I could taste it. I kept spitting just to keep from vomiting, and Herbie kept taking deep, slow breaths, but he was facing in the opposite direction then. It was like the foulest body odor mixed with the smell of dirty, sweaty feet with some rotten cabbage thrown in. I told him that I believed it to be an old hog wallow that had gone stagnant. A darn pack of wild hogs will root 'em in a place so that they can get to the cool, wet mud so they can cool themselves off, and every now and then an old hog will get in so deep that he can't get back out. The more he fights to get out, the more it mires itself in, until it just plays itself out and it rolls over and dies. I believe this to be the case, or something much like it. Old bad water mixed with mud full of rotting leaves and rotting pig could produce something very distasteful, but Herbie didn't think it was even close to putting a name on what it was. He didn't just tell me he thought I was mistaken, he told me that I was wrong, and that he now knew for sure what it was we were trying to find. Over and over, I asked him to tell me what it was and what could produce a smell like that. Each time he would ignore my request and he would just keep walking. I even ordered him to tell me what he knew. That did the same amount of good as asking him nicely. Once I even threatened to whip it out of him, and he just turned and stared at me with those dark eyes of his. I was a good bit bigger than he was, but we both knew that he was stronger and faster. Here's a piece of advice for you, Jody, that I wasn't planning on giving you, but it's good advice and it'll serve you well. Whenever you have a beef with someone who rarely talks and is completely comfortable with just staring at you until you get all itchy and nervous, give those types a wide berth. You can't ever tell what's going on inside a man's head if he won't speak. You might be thinking about rearranging his nose or shining his eye, and he might be thinking of doing a whole lot worse to you. Now get out while the getting's good, and you'll get to wake up the next morning. As long as you can do that, then you come close enough to winning to live with yourself. That's something from your old grandpa that you need to remember. But everything on this tape is, I think. The farther we went, the closer the smell became, and I begged my friend to tell me what it belonged to. He finally stopped walking and turned to me and he said, "I'll tell you if you will swear that we will leave this place and that you will never return here." I told him that I would go on without him if I must, but I wasn't leaving. My curiosity was too high and my pockets were too empty to simply abandon the place. I didn't say anything else before I started walking. I didn't turn around either. And when I heard him coming up behind me to catch up, he went past me and once again assumed the lead. We walked until we found ourselves in a patch of low ground, trees that were more deformed than any of those we had seen so far. Ferns and brown disease-looking ferns growing about the area, and apparently the main source of the terrible smell. In an area about an acre large, giant walled-out depressions in the earth were scattered about everywhere. "This is a bedding area," Herbie told me. "Those that use this place are probably out hunting for food." "What would live in such a place?" I asked him, but he remained silent and moved closer to one of the beds made in the soft dirt and ferns. I stood still and allowed him to make his observations at his own pace without interruption from me. I watched him as he knelt by what he called one of the beds, and he touched it softly. Possibly it was out of reverence and possibly out of fear. I watched as his face screwed up into an expression that I couldn't read. He leaned over and traced the outline of something beside the bed with a fingertip. And he looked all about him and then allowed his focus to go back to the bed quickly, as if something had caught his attention. I watched as he carefully lifted what I thought at the time was a tuft of moss. I'd never seen moss that looked so wiry and stringy, but I didn't know what else it could be. "Your father was very wise to warn you against coming to this place," he said, after he had risen and rejoined me. "We shouldn't be here," he said. "No one should ever come to this place. Everything deserves a chance to live in safety and peace, and our being here is taking that away." "We aren't threatening anything," I said. "We haven't cut the first tree. Besides, not to sound cold-hearted about it, but my family has cut timber on these 2,000 acres for generations, and there are more deer and turkey to be found now than ever before. If an animal doesn't like what I'm doing with my trees, it can go live somewhere else. It has the right to move along just the same as I have the right to provide for my family, the same right that you have." He led me over to where he had been squatting down and asked me what I saw. I told him that I had no idea what I was looking at, and he knew before asking that I wouldn't know. He told me it was the footprint of that which had slept in this place. I told him he was full of beans. Not even an elephant makes a track that big. I said that I have pretty big feet, and the track he was showing me was nearly twice as large as my print. He said that this print belonged to a thing that preceded the elephants. He picked up the wiry moss he had been studying earlier, and he handed it to me. As I ran my thumb and finger across it, I noticed that it was stiffer and more coarse than it looked. It was a dark orange color, like that wig your great-aunt Ruth wears all the time now. "Now smell your fingers," he told me. I felt sure that he was pulling my leg, but I did as he said for me to do, and it was all I could do not to gag and heave. "This is the hair of one of those who slept here," he said. I haven't ever seen an animal with hair like this, and especially not one that ever smelled like this. Something this strange with feet that big could be hard to miss. "You have not seen them because they do not wish for you to see them," he said to me, "and it is not an animal like you are imagining." "Well, I damn sure haven't ever seen a man with hair like that. Not even that drunkard who lives in the shack out behind the depot looks or smells this bad, and he's the filthiest human I've ever seen." "This does not belong to a man either. Not exactly," he said. "Well, so if it's not an animal, it's not a man. That doesn't leave a lot of options, does it? Why don't you tell me what's living in my trees, because we both know that I'm never going to guess." My family has always tried very hard to make sure that I have a very clear understanding of the two worlds that I live in, he said to me. I was to know as much about the white man's world as possible so that I could function and maybe one day be successful, but it was important to my family and to me that I knew everything there is to know about my people's history and knowledge and beliefs. I know the Indian words for many things that we speak of daily. It is all part of having one foot in one world and the other in a different world. But for this, I do not know if there is even a white word for it. I would tell you if I knew it. Many things are revered among my people, and we place a lot of emphasis on them. Maybe it's a river or a bear or an eagle, because they all have powers which should be respected. But there's an ancient group that very little is known about, that we talk about only in whispers. They do not wish contact with people, and we respect that. They are not men, and they are not animals, and they are not gods. They are somewhere in between all of that, or maybe they're a combination of all three. I'm not certain, and I don't believe that anyone else is either. To see even one of these beings is something to tell your grandchildren about with pride in many years after the fact. I've never once heard of anyone finding a whole community of them. Unless there is only one here sleeping in a different place each night, then a community is what we have discovered. We should consider ourselves more fortunate than most men for the gift that has come to us, but we should be extremely respectful and leave them in peace in this terrible place. It is not a good place to be, but they have made a home here where they hope not to be bothered, and we should honor that. It is the least we can do, and it is all they have ever asked from us. Who or what are you talking about? I asked Herbie. I told you that I do not know the white man's name for what lives here. I do not know if there is one. Maybe that was part of what frightened your father so badly. Perhaps he was so afraid because he didn't know of such things. Had he learned of the ancient ones, he might have at least had a crude understanding. The name I was taught to give them was dixiecryptid. It more or less means tall, hairy man, but there are more than that. What do you mean by more? I asked. Do they have special powers? Are they dangerous? I asked him. I've never heard of any special abilities they possess, but I have also never heard of anyone having contact with them. Maybe they can do wonderful things, and maybe they just spend all day looking for things to eat like squirrels and chipmunks do. Maybe they're immortal, and when you see one, you're seeing one of the first ones. I don't know, and neither does anyone else. I've never heard of anyone finding the bones of one of these things. So maybe they live forever, but because they choose to remain secluded, it would be difficult to find their remains if they do pass on. I'm sorry that I have so little information to give you, but I don't have it because it does not exist. So what do I do now? I asked him. Am I to abandon my family's needs because of a bedtime story your grandfathers and grandfather told you? Herbie looked really angry when I asked him that. Looking back, I don't guess I blame him. What I said out of frustration, but it had been insulting and hurtful, even though I had not meant for it to be. He took a moment before he responded to me. He thought more about the words he said than I did, and that is a quality I wish I had shared with him. I think you have been given a gift, he said. You have the only community of these ancient beings that I have ever heard of living under your protection. I'm beginning to think that maybe we have been talking about your father wrongly all this time. I no longer think that he was afraid, at least not entirely. I think that he understood, at least partly, that he was more than a timberman. He was also a protector of these beings. Maybe they don't come to you and ask for your protection so that they can remain hidden away where they simply live each day, but that does not mean that they're not here. Your father understood this on some level, and now you have to do as he did for so long. You have smelled them. You have seen where they sleep. You have rolled the hair from their bodies in your fingertips. Will you deny your senses, or will you accept that you have been permitted to do as your father did? He provided for his family all these years, but not at the expense of these ancients. You need to do no differently than he did. I think you will be rewarded with something greater than money if you do as your father did. Maybe it will only be laying your head down each night with the knowledge that you're doing a good and proper thing. I think more men would sleep better if they were afforded that gift. I stood up and walked away from Herbie a little piece. I studied that low patch of ground, and the more I looked, the more bedding wallows I was able to detect. Just a rough guess said there were more than 30 in that dismal place. I was trying to decide, not if all he had said was true or not, but if this truly was my responsibility. That was when we heard the sound. I'm not going to try to describe it to you, Jody, because I can't, and you won't believe me if I did. When I hear a dog howl, I know it's a dog. When I hear a coyote yip, or a deer blow, or a squirrel bark, I know what made those sounds. I had never heard anything like this. The sound was followed by a similar sound but different. Like the tones of voices between two men talking are similar but different. I was listening for all I was worth when Herbie grabbed me by the arm and started dragging me away. We ran without looking back until we reached the top of the ridge that overshadowed that little bowl of low ground. I stopped him and said that I wasn't going another step. He still didn't know my mind on all that we had found, and I think he had his jaws set to argue this point for some more. In fact, I'm sure he would have, but the first of them came into view, and neither of us could talk. They just kept coming into the bowl of ferns, coming in pairs and threes, growling or rumbling or keening, and maybe they were talking. Maybe they were just making sounds like a pack of rabbits do when they're out running. I don't know, but I couldn't look away. They didn't mill around. They simply went to those walled-out places and lowered themselves down, aside from the one who went to the bed where I had been fooling around. That one kept sticking his face into the breeze and sniffing. It would let out one of those bellows and then sniff again, but after a while it decided everything was all right, I guess, because it finally laid down too. There they were, sleeping like tots in a nursery, except that these tots were 7 and 8 feet tall and covered with hair like I was still clutching in my hand. I looked over and tears were inching their way down both Herbie's cheeks. To me, this was fascinating, but to him it was something almost of religious importance. I squeezed his shoulder and he patted my hand while I did that. It was my turn to pull against him so that we could start heading back. We walked a long time before we spoke. We're going to need to work very hard to make enough money so that that part of the property we just left never need be disturbed or molested, I said to him. He nodded his head while he wiped at his eyes. So, Jody, that's the secret I've kept from everyone all these years, just the same as my daddy kept the secret from me. I can only assume that everything down in that low ground is as it was. I have not been back since that first time. I came to the edge of these burly trees to record this, but I chose to go no farther. Herbie went back once and spent 2 days in there just watching and probably crying. We had worked many years together when he found out that he had a disease that could not be taken from him. He told me that he wanted to go back one more time to see the ancient ones, the dixiecryptid, and that he would like to do it alone. He died a few weeks after he returned, and I think he died happy. I know that you will probably go to try to find the place and them, and I wish you wouldn't, but I know you will. You are too much like me. I cannot stop you from going, and I cannot make your decisions for you, but I hope that you will see as I did that being granted a responsibility like our Father has been granted is greater than any amount of money you may deposit down at the S&L. Take care of the trees, Jody, and they will take care of you and yours. And keep the secret. I have faith that you will.